I'd like to thank our worship team and AV team for putting the worship service together this morning. Let's give them a round of applause. Did a great job. We are glad you're here today. We're in this chapter 9 of the story, and if you don't have a story Bible, we ask you to pick one up. And we just want you to plug in to this understanding God's big story in our lives and how that ties into where we're at in this lower story of our own lives. And so anyway, maybe you've seen the video or one like it on YouTube where this young boy is obviously anticipating a present from his mom, and I think he, in his eyes, it looks like he knows what he's going to get. And so with great anticipation, his mom hands her son this wrap box, this wrap present. And the boy, he's obviously expecting a certain gift in there. And he rips open the wrapping paper and he finds a picture on the box. It's a pottery wheel. And it's obvious that this is not what this boy was expecting. And he takes the gift and he just throws it across the room. Now, you probably have had one of those moments where you receive something you weren't expecting. All of us have probably had some time in our life where some great disappointment has entered into our world we did not ever expect happening. And so, in this story today, we're going to be looking at such a story in the lives of the people in the book of Ruth. And so sometimes our dreams get blown away with some type of life tornado, some great disappointment. Maybe it comes from a dishonest financial planner, a disappointing close friend. They betray us, they let us down. Some disillusion experience. You thought your spouse was this, but they turned out to be that. And this isn't what I expected moment. That's what the book of Ruth begins with. It begins with a moment of complete, unanticipated disaster. And so this book of Ruth takes place during the time of the judges, specifically during the time of Gideon's reign as a judge. And if you were here last week or if you read the book of Judges, it's a very dark period in the history of Israel. And then there's this book of Ruth, which is a gem of a story in the middle of complete darkness. And so this chapter begins with, "This isn't what I expected" moment. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. The names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. How could there be a famine in the land flowing with milk and honey? Right? Because that's what Canaan land was described as. These are God's people, and they were supposed to be blessed in the land, but God warned them if they turned from Him and worshipped other gods, if they copied the detestable practices of the Canaanites, that His hand of blessing would be removed from them and they would be disciplined by the consequences of their choices. And so this is what takes place. And so Elimelech moves his family from Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread, but there's no bread in the house. And so they hear that there's bread in Moab, and so this is where they're going to go. Now, Naomi's name means pleasantness, but it's not pleasant right now. Elimelech's name means my God is king, but it doesn't seem like the king is around right now. And so they go to a land where where the Moabites live. Moab, I guess that makes sense. But this was an arch enemy of Israel for 18 years. And so was it a good idea to go to Moab? Probably not. Does that mean God's not with them? Does not mean that. But the Bible doesn't really criticize him for the move, but it does show, at least in Elimelech's decision-making process, that he was lacking faith that God would provide for them if they just remained in their homeland. So they go there, and their story gets very, very dark. Now let me personalize this a little bit. Let's say it's family dinner night at your home, and dad comes in, husband comes in, and he sits quietly through supper. Then the kids go to bed. At about 10 p.m., he's watching the late news, and tears start to well up in his eyes. And the wife asks her husband what's wrong, and he says, "Honey, I just lost my job today. Not just me, but everyone lost their job. The plant shut down. The entire company has filed Chapter 13. And so a whole new set of questions begin to unfold in this family's life. Before it was, where are we going to go out to eat on Friday night? And now it's, how are we going to eat this week? And so choices have to be made, tough decisions. There's the selling of the house, selling of the family farm. There's moving to a distant country where everything's different, don't know any friends, family's not there. And so the job's gone, everything's gone. Family has this total upheaval. This is what's going on in the life of Elimelech and Naomi and their sons. And so they go to this land that's distant. The hunger is so bad that they're willing to risk moving to an enemy's territory to find something to eat. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Naomi didn't think it could get worse, but it got worse. And she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, and one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And they had lived there about 10 years when Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. It not only got bad, it got worse, and then after that, it just became tragic. Naomi's lost all that she has loved and known. And here she is in this foreign land. And so, if you know Israel's law, they were forbidden to marry outside of the clan of Israel, outside of the tribe of Israel, but their sons had no choice. They were in this distant land. After being there 10 years, it was time for them to press on with their lives. They did so, but then they themselves died. Mahlon's name means wimpy. I don't know what parent would name their son Wimpy, and Chilion, his name means perishing. So I'm not sure how that name change took place, but anyway, that's what their names meant. And so Naomi must have been thinking in this moment in her life, this isn't what I expected. And most of us have had one of these moments where life just turned worse and worse and worse. And it was this nightmare of a moment in her life, a desperate situation. But there's a ray of hope that comes into this moment. She finds out that there's bread in Bethlehem. And so she begins to move back home. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. When the two daughters-in-laws, she left this place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So Naomi heads back home without her husband, without her sons. They're buried in a distant land. And so without any way to take care of herself, she sets out on her way back with these two daughter-in-laws in tow, and she pleads with them to return back to the families that they were part of in Moab. Don't come back with me. You'll be foreign women in my land, and you should just stay there. So Orpah, she tearfully accepts the plea of Naomi and returns back home, but not Ruth. Ruth clings to Naomi, refusing to leave her. And what follows is one of the most beautiful descriptions of love that we have recorded in the Old Testament. And so we read this, "But Ruth replied to her mother-in-law, Naomi, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me.' When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her." Now, most of the time, we hear this passage of Scripture read at a wedding, right? I don't know if you've been there. And if we were to, stay in context and how the Scripture is supposed to be given, because typically what happens is the bride will say this to her husband. But if we were to stay in the context of Scripture, the bride would turn to her mother-in-law and say these words, which would be an awful, awkward moment at a wedding, but I would like to see it done one day. But anyway, it's read often to the husband, or the preacher reads it to the couple, whatever. But you get my point. I mean, look at the love this woman, this daughter-in-law of Naomi, has for her mother-in-law. And really what she's doing is she's holding on to the promises of Abraham and letting go of the gods of her land. She's going where Naomi is going. And she believes that there's something really important about Naomi, something very special about her people We don't know exactly what that is. It isn't described to us. But certainly, Ruth's allegiance to her mother-in-law reflects Abraham's commitment to the Lord when he left his land and went to a distant land that he didn't know the people or the language, and he believed in the promises of God. So there's an echo here that you should pick up on that goes all the way back to Abraham, some 700 years before this moment. And so you need to catch these little gems in Scripture because they're pointing to this phenomenal truth that when we decide to follow God, we usually have to step out into the unknown. And it can become very difficult. And bad things happen to good people, like bad things happen to bad people. But I'm just saying that there's this allegiance that she has. So let's continue in this journey. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. The women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord," and that's not really true, is it? "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So when she gets back to Bethlehem, the women in the town don't even recognize her. There's so much stress and hardship that has changed her outward appearance. And she wants to change her name from pleasantness to Mara, which means bitterness. She blames God for it. Have you ever blamed God for the troubles in your life, right? People do. And so we're not going to try to wrestle with this question like, could God have prevented it? Did God cause it? But the fact is that the suffering has come. And so we're going to see that God has not left her, even though she might think He has. And He's right there with her. Now, let me just make a point. It's real important to belong to the church. When I say belong, I don't mean attend. There's plenty of attenders that don't belong to the church. The church is a family. And have you ever noticed how God works through people? Like, sometimes we expect God to just like, ta-da! But oftentimes God works through the church at local and ordinary, doing the very mundane things like providing worship services and teaching and joy box giving, right? God works through ordinary people. And if you're not connected with the church, and you're not connected with the family of God, you're preventing yourself from receiving God's blessings. Because God works through the local church. God's salvation comes through the local church. The church, no matter how ordinary or no matter how dysfunctional it might be at times, God's still using it. God is stuck to the church, and He sticks with those who stuck with, right? I mean, He's stuck with us. and so anyway, it's just a truth. And so in this story, Ruth's friendship, it parallels the love that we ought to have to the local church. We ought to adore our church. I do. I look forward to being here. I know probably all of you look forward to being here. Why? Who would climber out in the rain and be here? But so anyway, God is bringing us together to help one another, and to remove ourselves from the church is to exclude ourselves from God's working out of love through His people. So very, very important. So when we face great loss in our lives, we need the church. Now, when it comes to great loss, when it comes to opening a box, and this isn't what I expected moment, when there's some suffering, you get to make a choice. You can be defined by your loss, now listen, or you can be defined by how you respond to it. The choice is yours. In this book by Jerry Sitzer, A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. Jerry Sitzer was a minister. He was at a retreat. He had led this successful retreat. And as he and his family were returning from this Indian reservation where the retreat was held, he was in one car, his wife and the rest of his family was in another car. And a drunk driver came and hit his wife's car and killed his wife, his daughter, and his grandmother. The driver of the car survived, but his pregnant wife died as well. This terrible moment of great loss. If you're going through a moment of great loss, this is a great book to read. This is a great source of encouragement. And he says in the book, the experience of loss does not need to be the defining part of our story. The defining moment can be the response to the loss. Everybody makes a choice. I've heard story after story of loss of people who know God. And in every one of those stories, they become my heroes. Because the loss did not define them. God's working out in that loss is what defined them. Their response to this. Bad things happen to all kinds of people. And unexpected things happen to all kinds of people. But everybody has to make a choice. Is this going to define me? Or is my response to the situation, with the Lord's help, going to be my defining moment? And so we can choose which way. Now, Naomi, obviously, when she returns back to Bethlehem, she's going to be defined by her loss. Call me Marah. Don't call me pleasantness, call me bitterness, because that's who I am. And so God's grace is quietly going to enter this story in Naomi and Ruth's life through a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz is a farmer. Apparently, he's got some wealth, some means. And Elimelech is distantly related to Boaz. Now, when Naomi returns with Ruth, she returns to the old house, which might have been existing, and the old land, which was existing. But there's no one to work the fields. Nothing's been planted there. They're going to starve to death if they don't do something. And so they could sell the land, but that still doesn't solve their immediate problem. And so what she convinces Ruth to do is to go out and glean in the fields of Boaz, someone who's got some connection to their family. And so when she does this, Ruth goes out there and she gleans in the fields. Now, there was a law in Israel's code of law that the farmers could only go through and harvest one time on their own land. After that, whatever fell to the ground, they could not pick up. That was the way the Lord provided for those who didn't have means to provide their own food. This was God's welfare plan, if you will, that those who didn't have anything could follow through the farmers and pick up what dropped to the ground in the corners of the fields and those kinds of things. And so this is what God's law provided. And Boaz is honoring God's law. Remember, we're in the book of Judges. We're in the time of Gideon. It's very dark, but here's one godly man who's following God's law and providing for those who can't provide for themselves. So Ruth goes out and she gleans, and Boaz sees her. And she's a Moabite. Like, she can't hide her identity. There might have been some physical features, some clothing features that might have identified her as a foreigner. And she's alone, and she's not recognized by the other men in the field. And Boaz knows she's at great risk. And so when he hears about that she is the woman who returned with Naomi, his distant relative, he's impressed with her faithfulness. He has compassion on her. And so Boaz said to Ruth, gleaning in the field, says, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you," which implies they would have. "And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink of water from the jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." This is a life and death moment for these two women. And they receive this generosity and protection from Boaz. So Ruth runs home to Naomi, and she tells her all that has happened. And so this is God's law, if you will, working out in the lives of the people. It's important that we understand that God's the moral lawgiver, and we do what he says for life. We disobey what he says for death. And so life is given through God's law. Now, Naomi's mind begins working. Well, he's a distant relative, and he showed compassion on us, and he's protecting us. And so what she understands is if she has to sell her land to survive the next harvest, essentially what she's doing is she's designating the rest of her family offspring, if there is any, to a life of servitude. Because in Israel, once you lose your land, you lose your identity. You become a servant or a slave to the person who you work for. And there's no redeeming that. We don't even, there was a law in place called the Year of Jubilee, but we don't even have any record if that was ever obeyed. But that's another story. But anyway, so she begins to think. There's this law of the kinsman redeemer. There's a way to keep her family alive. And so what she does is she tells Ruth, she says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to bathe because you stink. You've been in the field all day, right? I want you to put on your best clothes, and then what perfume we have left, we're going to cover you with it. And then I want you to return back to Boaz at the end of the day and ask him essentially to marry you. So here's what we read. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went down to the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my guardian redeemer of our family." Now, I don't know about the other husbands in the room, but this happens to me all the time. My wife's in Maine. I can say anything, right? I wake up in the middle of the night, and it's not Ruth. It's Marie, keeping my feet warm. Right? So anyway, what's this all about? Well, again, this law of the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, is a way that a woman who has a deceased husband, a son can be raised up in her husband's name to keep the land. This is what's going on here. And we don't have time to unpack all this, but you can read about this in the book of Deuteronomy. So anyway, she snuggles up to Boaz's feet, keeping his feet warm. He wakes up in the middle of the night, and she's essentially asking him to become her kinsman redeemer. She's offering herself as a bride to him. And so that sounds really cool for him. Maybe she was attractive, maybe she wasn't. Obviously, she's much younger than he is, but we have to understand what this is going to cost Boaz. He has to come up with the money to buy the land. He has to raise up a son, which is going to cost him time and money, that will really never, ever be his. It will be Naomi's offspring, Ruth's offspring, from her deceased husband. So he really has to put himself out there to make this happen. He's going out on quite a limb. So the next day, he goes to where all the official business takes place in the town of Bethlehem, and that's at the gates of the town where the elders sit. And there was one man there who was closer to Naomi in family relations than he was. He has to ask him for permission. This guy does not want to get involved in this, and so he receives a green light to be the guardian redeemer of Naomi and Ruth. And so it came at a high price, but there's a happy ending to this story. And as time goes on, they have a son. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive. She gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to God the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer." The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So her name changes again. They didn't call her Marah, they called her Naomi. And so she sees that she's pleasant and beautiful again. She takes that name on, right? Kind of, she didn't wait for God to work in all of this. But the story isn't finished because Obed is born, and Obed gives birth to King David, who gives, in his family line, Jesus comes from. Do you realize who Boaz's grandmother was? She was a prostitute in Jericho. Her name was Rahab. God is at work in the most unconventional ways, in things we could never see. And sometimes we can't feel His presence, but He's there. Sometimes the circumstances look so dark and dismal, we can't imagine that God would even be in the middle of this. Like, He's abandoned me. Now, what I love about Boaz is he's a man of justice. Because he's living among men who were not men of justice. He's a defender of the weak and the orphan, and God has a lot to say about that. And so there's this passage in Proverbs, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. We have to be, if we're Christians, if we're part of the church, we have to be people of justice. We have to be defending those who cannot defend themselves. This past week, I had an opportunity with my wife to attend a training session hosted by this group right here, Haven, of the Dan River region. They're a national group. And they provided training on helping people in domestic violence, people who've been involved in sex trafficking, women and men of abuse, and elder abuse, which is growing in our area. Elders, when I'm talking about the older people that don't have family and are often abused because they're really defenseless. But anyway, Haven provides support. Now, I'm going to put this number up here, and I have information that can help you. If you know someone who's in domestic abuse, if sex trafficking that exists in Chatham and Pittsylvania County, these people provide an advocacy program to help people get out of bad situations. And I was alarmed to learn at some of the statistics. By the way, after the service, you want to come talk to me about this, I'll fill you in on more of the blanks that you might have. But one in three high school students who are dating report physical or sexual abuse. Of all the reports that are given to the police of domestic or sexual abuse, only 2% turn out to be fraudulent. Only 2%. So by and large, 98% of what's reported is actually factual. And so what we have to understand is that we are sometimes the first step that people come to find help in getting out of some injustice, getting out of some abuse. Now, sadly, there's been some really stupid leaders in the church that have told people who are being abused in marriages to stay in that abusive marriage because they've made a commitment to the Lord. And the Bible doesn't teach that. And if anyone is in an abusive situation, get out, get help, and seek justice. And so what I'm trying to do is educate myself and educate the church more about problems that exist in our area, and that we understand that we're part of helping people who are being emotionally abused through words, physically abused through, actions of violence, or sexually abused. And it is a real problem. Now, if you're part of this family, you're already part of the solution. Baby Bottle Boomerang, what are you doing? You're raising money for young parents who don't have a clue about how to have a child, right? Maybe they need help. If you give to the Joy Box, you helped a young mother, single, no husband in her life, take her child to a distant hospital, provided gas money for her. So what I'm saying is, if you're part of this church, you're plugged in, you're giving, you're paying attention to announcements, like what's going on, you're part of the solution. And that's a good thing to know. I think you ought to pat yourself on the back. I'm concerned about people who are experiencing injustice. And so anyway, like on Thursday nights, there's a group that shows up here that don't understand English very well. They're from a distant country. They don't know our language, and they're being coached on how to learn English. Well, you're giving to this congregation, keeps the lights on, keeps the heat on or the cool on or whatever. You're part of the solution. And so I'm just saying that it's not all bad. We do have to recognize there are a lot of people in our county that are being abused and need help to get out. I don't know, man. Maybe there's something more that God has laid upon your heart that He might be calling you to do, and you're like, I've always had this desire to help this group of people. Well, let's talk about that. All right, let's get back to our story. Boaz, he's going to be the Redeemer, and Boaz foreshadows the work of Jesus Christ. He had the right to redeem. He had the will to redeem, he had the right to redeem, and he had the power to redeem. So what Boaz is doing is he's pointing to Jesus. Like all these books are pointing to Jesus. He's the ultimate redeemer. And God's going to go out of his way, like Boaz did, go out of his way to help the distant, the broken. And so this is what he does. And so as we understand that, through this bloodline will come Messiah. Now, about Ruth. Ruth foreshadows the church. She loves Boaz like we love Jesus. She seeks to take his name. So we walk away from our family names, essentially, and we bear the name of Christ. And she depends upon the protection and provision of her kinsman redeemer. And just like we do, God's protecting us. God's got us. God's got your retirement. God's got, He's got our help. He's got it. And so she foreshadows the work of the church. Now, so here's the message of Ruth. God is at work even when it seems hopeless. If you wanted to give a synopsis of the entire book, God is at work even when it seems hopeless. Romans 8:28, love this passage, probably my favorite one. If I ever got a tattoo, it would probably be this verse. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. One of the things I love about the book of Ruth is that never in this book does God's name appear. Now, the word redeem appears over 20 times, but what I'm trying to say is that in this particular book, God is quietly at work. God spoke to Abraham. He gave Moses a burning bush. Joseph had dreams. Noah built an ark. Jonah was in a big fish. Samson had super strength. But when you read through the book of Ruth, you never see any of these big miraculous moments. You see one man of justice follow God's word and redeem those who are broken, poor, and dying. There's no dramatic answer to prayer, like no parting of the Red Sea, right? There's no closing of the mouths of lions. It's just one family that needed a lot of help and found it through one ordinary farmer. Isn't that cool? And we love this book. And so you can clearly see that God is in our lives, working when it seems like there's no answer. So in your story, you might look for a big miraculous work of God, but I'll tell you what happens most of the time. Most of the time it's when people are connected somehow to God's church, and quietly and almost passively God is working through the ordinary gifts of ordinary people who do extraordinary things because God does heavy lifting in desperate moments. And so if you give God a chance, he's at work. I'm going to ask our worship team to come on up. If you trust God and give him the opportunity to work, your story doesn't have to be about loss or disappointment. It can be a story of redemption. No one could have predicted that two widows who became friends in a distant land would lead to the future offspring of the Messiah who would save the whole world. Who would have thunk it? No one would have thunk it. And so all of us are going to have these moments in our life where it's a box that we didn't expect. Maybe the box doesn't say pottery wheel. Maybe it says chemo or financial loss or failure of a spouse. And you get to toss that box across the room, or you get to make a choice and unwrap it. You get a choice of being defined by your loss, or you get a choice of being defined by how you respond to the loss. So, I don't know what your box is labeled, but it may be something really tragic. In that video I started out with, that boy, his mother goes and picks the box up across the room. She brings it back to her son and says, "Open the box." And he opens it up, and inside are a bunch of controllers, Xbox games, and a brand new Xbox. His first response was, this isn't what I expected. And so, right now, the box you might be looking at is labeled widow, or widower, or abandoned, or poor, or unemployed. Maybe it's cancer, or maybe that box is labeled no one loves you. Here's what you need to do. Trust that the Lord is working in the most desperate of moments. He works through his people, and he can do amazing things. Let's pray.
Thank you for joining us. You can find us on the web at cornerstonechatham.org.